Hey, if you got a Bible this morning, would you grab it and start making your way to Romans chapter 14 today? Romans chapter 14 is where we're going to be. If you got a paper Bible, it's about 3/4 of the way back. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and then you'll find Romans right after that. Go ahead and make your way there. And as you're turning there, you may be familiar. At Doxology, we have this value as a church. We call it part of our DNA. We call it biblical teaching that's portable. And it's just part of our DNA here. What we want to do every single time we open up the scriptures together is we want to open them up. We want to look at what's in there. We want to kind of unpack it a little bit and then pack it back up and put handles on it so that we can carry it with us into our week, wherever we find ourselves, so that we can take it into our Monday through Saturday. So that we're prepared every time we open up the scriptures, and we're preparing to be able to go and be Doxology, not just on Sunday, but Monday through Saturday. That's part of our desire. I'm aiming a little more narrow this week, if it's okay with you. So here's what I want to do with Romans chapter 14. I want to put handles on Romans 14 after we've unpacked it, hopefully so that you can carry it into your Thursday. Does this sound okay? Because I don't know what you're doing Thursday. I don't know if you're going to grandma's house or grandma's coming to you, or if you're going to neighbors' houses or you're having people over to you. But what I want to do for us is take Romans 14, unpack it a little bit, put some handles on it so that whatever else you're taking to the table with you on Thursday when you go, Romans 14 can be one of the things. That sound okay? Because you know they're bringing stuff, right? And I'm not just talking about turkey. At some point, if your family's anything like my family, and I imagine that your family's a lot like my family, like if your neighbors are anything like my neighbors, I imagine your neighbors are a little like my neighbors, at some point on Thursday, someone is going to put it on the table. It may happen in a private conversation with one of your family members or your neighbors. May happen right there with everybody right at the table. But at some point, in some moment, someone is going to put it right out there for everyone to see and talk about. And I want to prepare you for it. What's it? Well, I don't know. Let's kind of look inside here a little bit. I think we've got some things that we could maybe talk about and find some agreement on, prepare. Oh, here's something. This will be really good. Did you get some of these on the way in? Yeah, go ahead and pull those out, and you can start unwrapping them now. Your delayed gratification is over. The Freeland family, we call these Jumpin Cookies, and I don't remember which of our kids named them that, but it's for a really good reason. Every time Carrie sends me to the store, these things magically jump in our cart. It's the craziest thing. So the kids just started calling them Jumpin Cookies, you know? So we had a moment not that long ago in our family that I think you can help me with. We were all sitting around the table after dinner partaking in Jumpin Cookies. And I look over, and I asked Carrie's permission before I share this because it's kind of humiliating for her. I looked over as she got ready to eat her Jumpin Cookie. Like, honestly, I was horrified, okay? So I look over, there she is. She takes the Jumpin Cookie and just exactly like that, puts it in her mouth. I know, right? I'm like, Carrie, what are you doing? Like, you don't eat it like that. And the kids, they're sitting at the table going, come on, Mom. Like, you don't eat it like that. I said, you tell them. Like, let's show her. Let's show her how to eat the Jumpin Cookies. And so my kids each showed her a different way to eat the Jumpin Cookies. My kids all did it the wrong way, too. And I found myself sitting there thinking, everybody in this house is crazy except me. So, you can help us. My kids, my family are here in this service. You can show them. And I just think, like, we're all Jesus followers here. We're going to agree on this, right? We know the right way to do this. You're a well-pastored church. This is what I believe. So, can we together, like, show my family and each other the right way to eat a Jumpin Cookie? Go ahead. I'm watching. Go ahead. Yeah, you twist it, you eat the icing, and then you eat the cookies individually. Not like that. Most of the people in this church are crazy, except me. And a few people like me. Now, if we're going to try to agree on something, probably Jumpin Cookies is not it. Let's put that back in there. I imagine we could find some others. Oh, here, this will be good. This is a really good one. I got a mask. We can all agree on this. Right? No. Bad idea. Vaccine. We're together on the vaccine, right? All of us together on we're not all together on the vaccine. That's probably not going to be a good idea either. Okay, what about a donkey and an elephant? Can we see that eye to eye? If it comes to the table and it's this, we okay? No, not okay. Okay, maybe we need to move outside the realm of current events. Here, it's a beer. We all together on that? No? There's an open joke in our family of whether or not it is showing up to the holidays. There's a joke about if there's going to be an open bar at the holidays. That wouldn't be a joke in your family. It's a joke in my family because I grew up in a good teetotaling Baptist household, and so when we joke, going to be an open bar for the holidays, everybody kind of laughs. Like my parents at least are hoping that's a joke. Some people in extended family, they're kind of hoping maybe that's not a joke. If it shows up that's probably not the best thing for us to get together on today. I got a movie. Let me check. Nope, that's rated R. Can't talk about that one. That's not going to work. A tweet. This is a tweet from a person with an honest question. I'm trying to figure out what to do with my kid for kindergarten, public schools, private schools, homeschool. What do you think? No. Okay. What's this? Untucked shirts. An ad for untucked shirt. I don't know what that's doing in there. Okay. I don't know what it is when it comes to your house this Thanksgiving, but at some point I bet it shows up. And I want to try to prepare us today for it, whatever it is. There's a lot of stuff that gets packed up in it with us, isn't there? What do we do with it? Because the chances are some version of it showing up to the table on Thanksgiving, and for some of us, it may not wait until Thursday. If you've located Romans chapter 14, look at what Paul says. He gives us some help on how to deal with it. He says, chapter 14, verse 1, accept the one whose faith is weak without quarreling over, underline this, disputable matters. All right, so Paul's going to give us some help with it. He tells us he's going to talk about disputable matters. So let me get a little technical and give you a little Greek real quick because I think it's really important. Dive deep into the weeds here. Okay, so the Greek word for disputable means this. You ready? Disputable means something that is disputed. So notice, that's a pretty big suitcase that Paul's planning to talk about in Romans chapter 14, isn't it? I mean, he's talking about all the things. He's talking about the political things, talking about the medical things, talking about the social things, talking about the theology things. The Greek word is the word dialogos. It's the word that we get our word dialogue from. So Paul's not talking about the things that all of us agree about. And he's also not talking about all of the things that none of us care about. He's talking about the things that there's a dialogue about, a conversation about, maybe even a dispute about. That's what Paul has in mind. I think we might need a bigger suitcase. We look at Romans chapter 14, the first part of 15 today, to prepare ourselves for Thursday. Paul's actually going to invite us to ask 3 really important questions about it, whatever it is, to prepare us to respond on Thursday when it comes to the table. Here are the 3 questions that he invites us to ask. He wants us to ask first, number 1, what's on the table? What is on the table? Number 2, who is at the table? And the third question is, what's at stake? What's on the table? Who's at the table? And what's at stake? First thing he invites us to ask is, what's on the table? So you could also just clarify it. What is it? Notice Paul's going to walk us through a really, really specific it in his day. And it wasn't something trivial like jumping cookies. It was one of those things that when his first audience read through this letter and he gets to this and he names this, everybody kind of eyes got big and go, oh, whoa, I guess we're going to talk about that. Kind of the way you felt when I pulled out a mask, the vaccine. Like, oh, well, okay, these seats have seat belts. That's the way they would have felt when Paul mentions these things that Paul mentions. Look what he says, verse 2. One person's faith allows them to eat anything, but another, whose faith is weak, eats only vegetables. Let the reader understand, right? Then verse 5, look what he says. One person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. So I'm assuming that you're probably not feeling triggered in this moment by those examples. But these were huge deals to early Christ followers. See, the problem when you went to Costco in the first century, you didn't have a choice between prime meat and choice meat. Your decision was between meat that was offered to idols and meat that wasn't. But the thing when you went to Costco in the first century was the meat that was sacrificed to idols, it was the best kind of meat. It were the best cuts of steak. And it was the cheapest cut of meat. And yet it had been offered to idols. And so when people began to follow Jesus, they looked around and said, well, we can't eat that. And for a lot of different reasons. Some people said, we can't eat that meat. It might contaminate us. Other people said, we can't eat that meat, and we can't eat meat at all, because if we eat meat, somebody out there might wonder if we're eating that meat, and we're not eating that meat, but we're not going to eat any meat. So if you really want to follow Jesus, everybody just needs to eat vegetables. And then there's another group of people that say, I'll eat it. Like, give me the steak. Send it my way. I'm a steak guy. Steak's fine. Steak's great. All kinds of people on an issue that was disputed. It showed up at the table. And notice Paul's going to take a side. Paul is team steak. He says elsewhere, 1 Corinthians chapter 8, like idols aren't a thing. Steak's steak, and steak's great. Pass me the steak. But notice this, and I think this is cool. Romans chapter 14, verse 6, look what he says. He says, whoever regards one day as special, check this out, does so to the Lord. Whoever eats meat does so to the Lord, for they give thanks to God. And whoever abstains does so to the Lord and gives thanks to God. I mean, notice this. Paul not only knows what it is, he's got an opinion about it. But he also knows why people who disagree with him about it disagree with him about it. And he paints them, you notice that, in the best possible light. He hasn't just heard about the dialogue on cable news and Instagram and Facebook with all of the people that he watches in his echo chamber that all think the same way he thinks and just gives him new talking points and zinger kind of arguments to shut down the conversation whenever it comes to the table. He's actually had the conversation. He's had the dialogue. He's engaged in the dispute. He knows people that see it differently from the way he sees it and who come at it for the same reason that he comes at it. He doesn't attack their character. He doesn't misrepresent their motives. He doesn't commit a suicide when it comes to their motives. Again, even on a really, really big issue for Paul and the people of his day. That's important for us on Thursday, isn't it? To engage in the dialogue, to engage in the conversation and not misrepresent positions and commit a suicide with other people's character. But notice, just knowing what it is and why they approach it, the reason that they do, and paint it in the best possible light, doesn't solve everything. It'd be enough if we were the only person at the table, but the chances are we're not going to be the only person at the table. And everyone may not see it the way you see it, or the way I see it. What do you do then? What do we do with it when we know what it is and we know why other people see it differently, but we're still convinced that we're right and everyone else in the world is crazy? Even the people at our table on Thursday. What do I do when I show up at the table and I believe I'm free to eat steak, but I notice the person across from me orders a salad. What do I do when I want wine with my steak, but I'm pretty sure the person on the other side of the table is Baptist? What do I do when I hate wearing masks? And I don't believe masks work. But my neighbor who hates wearing masks too believes that they do work and that they're important for me to wear. What do I do when I believe that getting the vaccine is the right thing to do and that everybody should? And you couldn't disagree with me more. We can't both be right. We can't both have what we want. So what do we do with it then? Well, Paul helps us with that too. He says you got to ask the second question as well. You got to ask the question, who's at the table? So notice there are more seats than just our seat at the table. A few different seats at the table. First chair you see over here at the head of the table is the chair for the strong believer. And notice this, when you look at Romans chapter 14, Paul assumes, if you're a believer, Paul assumes that you assume you're in the strong chair. That's kind of the humor of the passage, isn't it? I mean, nobody in the conversation ever believes that they're in the weak position, that they're a weaker believer in the conversation. They believe they're on the side of truth. We believe we're on the side of truth. We're the stronger person at the table. We're the stronger believer. We're on the right side of the facts. People who really love Jesus, like we really love Jesus, they're going to approach it like we do. What do? When we find ourselves sitting in the seat as the stronger believer as the table. For us and for people like us, look what Paul invites us to do. A couple of things. Look at verse 5. Romans chapter 14, verse 5. He says, one person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Both of them are convinced that they're the stronger believer in the conversation. What should they do? Look what he says. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. What do I do when I find myself in the strong seat? Well, the first thing Paul invites us to do is develop your own conviction. Develop your own conviction. Make sure you're clear on what you're going to do with it, or what you're not going to do with it. And that may even be on an area of personal freedom for you. You may believe that you're free to do it, whatever it is, but you're going to choose not to do it because the fact that I'm free to do it doesn't mean that I should do it, right? Like, for example, and I'll give you a really specific example, you may say, I believe that a person who's following Jesus is free to watch certain shows on television. But the fact that I'm free to doesn't necessarily mean that I should. So I'll give you an example. A bunch of you, watched Game of Thrones. This is not me saying that you sinned. This is not me saying that you didn't. This is me saying from my vantage point, things that I know about that television show, I can't imagine how a person in the middle of following Jesus could be watching that. But you don't answer to me. And Paul's going to say that in this passage. So you don't answer to me, and I'm not going to answer for you. So he says, in all of these areas, be fully convinced in your own mind. And that leads us to the other thing that he says, and he says it really clearly. The second thing is this: aim your convictions vertically. Aim your convictions vertically. Develop your own convictions and then aim them vertically. Look what he says, Romans chapter 14, verse 22. He says, so, whatever you believe about these things, whatever it is, whatever you believe about it, keep these things between yourself and God. Now, since you know the context, you know verse 1, you know how he started into this thing, you know he's not saying just sweep it under the rug, like don't talk about it, don't make sure it doesn't ever come up in a conversation. It's not what he's saying here. In fact, he's saying, I'm expecting the conversation. I'm expecting that that's what strong believers do, is have the conversation. There should be a dialogue. I'm expecting maybe even a dispute. You're going to come in fully convinced, and I'm going to come in fully convinced, and we're going to have a conversation as two fully convinced people on different sides of an issue, whatever it is. He's not saying don't ever talk about it. Here's what he's saying. He's saying your convictions can't ever become everyone else's commandments. Your convictions can't become everyone else's commandments. So apply that to what I just said a second ago. I don't have a chapter and verse that says, thou shalt not watch Game of Thrones. I can triangulate some passages that come up with a principle that make me pretty sure I'm right. But you may be pretty sure you're right. And standing on your convictions, you get to make your decision about it. And if you're totally convinced, your own mind, knowing that you're going to stand before Jesus someday, and that's all over this passage, verse 10, we're all going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. But he doesn't say that. Paul doesn't say that as a threat. He says it's an invitation to live into the gray areas, live into those areas of freedom, knowing we're all going to stand in front of Jesus. So if you're totally convinced in your own mind, knowing you're going to stand before Jesus someday and give an account for why you watched that show or didn't, why you got vaccinated or didn't, why you wore a mask or drank the beer or didn't, if you're doing whatever you're doing, believing it is his best for you, I'm not going to make my conviction your commandment, even if I don't change my conviction. And I'm not planning to change my conviction. In fact, that's how Paul defines strong. You notice that? Strength and maturity doesn't mean that you're the person who's right. It's not just about the position that you hold. Strength is about how you hold the position that you hold. So you could have two people at the same table on opposite sides of the issue that both sit in the seat of the strong believer, who are able to say, you know what, we don't see eye to eye on this. We don't see eye to eye, and yet we believe we're both aimed towards him. And as strong believers in an area of freedom, we're going to walk together towards him and believe the best about each other. Wouldn't it be great? Come on, if Thursday you showed up and it was only strong people at the table. Whatever it is, you see it one way, they see it a different way. You have the conversation or you don't. You have the dialogue or you don't. You have the dispute or you don't. And at the end of the conversation, you still are brothers who love each other and walk into the rest of your day. It'd be great if strong people like us were the only people sitting at the table. But Paul says, you should expect there are going to be some other people there too. There's some other seats here as well. Let's assume that the strong seat is covered by us. A couple other tables here. This one right here, this is for the weak believer. And you meet them in chapter 14, verse 1, don't you? Paul talks about the weak believer right there at the very beginning. What do you do when you're the strong person, but you sit at a table with somebody that's weak? Well, Paul says first, accept them without picking a fight. But he goes even further. Look what he says in chapter 14, verse 13. He says, therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put any, two words, stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. Look down at verse 15. If your brother or sister is distressed because of what you eat, you are no longer acting in love. Do not by your eating destroy someone for whom Christ died. Two words there. When you realize there's a person that's a weaker believer at the table, the first one is stumbling block. The second one is obstacle. The word stumbling block comes from a word that means to cut off or to blow up. So you get the idea of a military activity that blows up a bridge between one place and another. Paul says, don't blow up bridges between you and another person when the other person is a weaker believer. Don't be that kind of person. The second word is the word obstacle. It doesn't just mean something that somebody trips over. You get the idea of Mario Kart. Intent is all over it, okay? So if you played Mario Kart, you know, you're driving down the road and you're intentionally throwing traps behind you for people behind you to stumble or to fall and to get diverted off the track. This is either you sit with someone that you know is a weaker brother, maybe a salad person, and you decide to blow them up. You're just going to order a big, fat, blue, rare steak just to make a point in their presence. Paul says, don't do that. Or it's the person that's away at the restroom and you order their salad for them, just order it with bacon bits on the bottom. And you don't tell them till they brag about what a great salad it is. You know, Paul's like, what are you doing? That's not consistent with our faith. It's not love. You're trying to blow up someone's conscience so that you can get what you want? That's the opposite of living out our faith, right? So that's Paul's advice. When it comes to the weak believer, what he tells us to do is this: temporarily limit participation to stay in a conversation. Temporarily limit participation in order to stay in a conversation. Doesn't mean I cave on my convictions. Doesn't mean I hide my conviction. Doesn't mean I'm weak. I'm not. It's the opposite of that. Paul says if Jesus loved a person enough to die for them, and you don't love them enough to temporarily lay aside your freedom when it comes to it, it may be time for you to examine whether or not your love is in the right order. If you're in front of another person and you know having a beer in front of them is going to, quote unquote, distress them, don't drink the beer. If you're in front of another person and you know that you're not wearing a mask is going to distress them, put down the mask for a second. Put it on for a second. Like, Jesus died for you. I can wear a muzzle for a minute while we have the conversation. For a minute. And that's important to say in this passage. There's a person that sometimes shows up in this conversation that does not have a seat at the table. Sometimes what we hear from well-meaning Christ followers is that the right thing to do is to limit ourselves in all areas of freedom because there's a hypothetical, imaginary weak believer who might be out there somewhere and might accidentally see you and trip up. And so don't ever live into a gray area. Don't ever exercise your freedom in Christ because it might trip up a hypothetical, imaginary brother out there somewhere. Notice in this passage, that person doesn't exist. Paul doesn't have that person in mind in Romans chapter 14 or in 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10 that also talks about a similar issue. And have that person at the table. He's talking about an actual person and an actual conversation over an actual issue. When you're with a weaker brother, temporarily limit participation in order to engage in a conversation, hoping that the weaker believer won't stay weak forever. This is similar but different from what Paul says about another person who's sitting at the table. This is the unbeliever who's sitting at the table. This is a person who doesn't know Jesus. They don't follow Jesus. Come on, we can't be surprised when people that don't know Jesus and follow Jesus live like people who don't know Jesus and follow Jesus. We can't expect them to live like people who do. When it comes to unbelievers, here's Paul's advice on this. He says, when it comes to an unbeliever that's sitting at your table, do whatever will keep the focus on Jesus. Whatever will keep the focus on Jesus. Here's how Paul says it in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19 to 23. He says, to the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings. To the Jew, I look like a Jew. To the Gentile, I look like a Gentile. He's not advocating hypocrisy here. It's not hypocrisy to believe that I've got freedom in an area, but choose to live apart from that freedom for a moment in time. That's not hypocrisy. I don't have to do everything I'm allowed to do just because I'm allowed to do it, right? Let me give you an example that I think goes the other way too. A person on our staff who back during the height of COVID had a personal conviction that it was the right thing to do in public wherever you were in order to protect the vulnerable to wear a mask. That may not have been your conviction. That may not be your conviction today. That was their conviction at that point. Anytime they found themselves in public, they believed it was the right thing to do for everybody to wear a mask. And they got an invitation to a neighbor's house. And it just so happened to be a neighbor that they knew is not a believer. For several different reasons. They were having some people over to their house, and so they decided to show up. And they show up, knock on the door, they're wearing their masks, show up at the house, and pretty quickly realize they're not the only people at the place, but they're the only people at the place that are wearing masks. And through some things that the neighbor said and the other people in the room said, it became really, really clear that any opportunity that they had to talk about anything other than the mask was going to go away as long as they were wearing the mask. And so they chose their decision in order to keep the focus on Jesus to take off the mask and put it in their pocket and pray like crazy. Did they make the right decision? Well, I don't know. They don't answer to me. But it seems to me like a pretty good application to this principle. Keep the focus on Jesus. Whatever keeps the focus on Jesus, to live like that. Anything short of sin, right? Okay, the last person at the table is important. The high chair is for the legalist at the table. The legalist is the person that says, if you want to be right with God, you got to be right like me. And the reason that they're represented by the high chair is that the person who sits in the legalist chair is the person who's always convinced that they're the most important person in the room. They're always convinced that they're the most mature person in the room. And they live by a mantra that says, I want what I want, like I want it, when I want it, how I want it, whenever I want it. And I want everybody else's world to revolve around me. Over and over and over, Paul says, when it comes to the legalist, be clear about the legalism and live out your own convictions. Paul says, don't limit your freedom for a legalist. And he modeled that all throughout his letters. But it's not just Paul. Jesus did this all through his ministry, didn't he? He was constantly healing people on the Sabbath. The legalists thought nobody should ever do anything on the Sabbath. Jesus heals people on the Sabbath. He touches the untouchable people. He loves the unlovable people. He forgives the unforgivable people over and over and over. He's clear on the legalism and he lives into his freedom. Calls out the legalists with freedom and courage. Why? With all of this, why would we live this way? Why would we make these decisions? What's at stake? Well, really quickly, look at chapter 15, verses 2-4. Paul says, each of us should please our neighbors for their good, to build them up. For even Christ didn't please himself, but as it's written, the insults of those who insult you have fallen on me. For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we may have hope. What's at stake? Living this way around it at the table on Thursday, our unity, our doxology, and our hope. You see all three of those right there. If all we ever do is tear each other down, we will never stand together, even for the things that matter the most. If I destroy you for the things we dispute about, it'll divide us in everything, even the things that matter. It'll affect our unity together. Second thing, it'll affect our doxology, showing and telling who Jesus is and what he's like wherever we're sent. Paul says that pretty explicitly here, doesn't he? We never look less like Jesus than we do when we exercise our rights at the expense of the people that we're called to love. Jesus went the opposite way. He wasn't motivated by the question, what do I prefer? What do I deserve? What am I owed? Even what am I free to do? He was motivated by the question, what does love require of me from here? And he lived in light of it everywhere he went. It affects our unity and our doxology, and it affects our hope. Did you see that? Not our eternal hope, hope of the purpose for which God's left us here, the mission while we're here. Our hope for the world where we live. And that's what the rest of Romans 15 is all about. Our greatest hope is not something that our politicians on either side can ever be counted on to provide for us or protect for us. Our greatest hope is not found in keeping our liberties, as much as I am pro-liberty and prefer liberties. Our greatest hope is that liberty or not, we will always keep our credibility and our humility so that a world that self-destructs around every dispute could see a different way. The way of dignity and honor and humility, clarity and boldness and courage and hope. The way Jesus loved us. Would you bow your head with me? Father, this is so hard. It's so hard to live in the tension between black and white and so much in the gray. It's hard to live that way with each other, even people that think like us and look like us. It's hard to live this way with people that are weak and they just can't hold a position without coming after us. It's hard to hold this with people that don't know you and to keep the focus on you, even in light of stuff that we prefer and things that we want and things that we believe are right. But they're not black and white. Lord, legalists are really hard. For us to be people who stand with boldness and courage while also standing with dignity and respect, being clear about the gospel and who you are. But Lord, even though it's hard, would you let us live this way? Because the world needs to see people that live and love like Jesus. That's what we believe we're called to. It's what we're called, showing and telling who you are and what you're like wherever you send us in the world. Would you let us live this way this week, and Lord God, especially on Thursday. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.